How does a king win a battle without ever drawing his sword? Picture this three massive armies marching toward a small nation, their war drums echoing across the desert like thunder before a storm. The dust clouds from their approach darken the horizon. Spears glint in the sunlight like a forest of death advancing closer with each passing hour. This small nation of Judah stands defenseless. Their army is outnumbered 10-1. Their walls won't hold. Their weapons seem like toys compared to the enemy's arsenal. Their king faces an impossible choice: surrender and watch his people become slaves, or fight and watch them die. But what if I told you there was a third option? What if the greatest victory in military history was won not with swords and shields, but with something far more powerful? What if the secret weapon wasn't made of bronze or iron, but of faith and song? Today, we're diving into one of the most extraordinary stories ever recorded. A story where worship becomes warfare, where prayer becomes strategy, and where surrender to God leads to the most spectacular victory imaginable. This isn't just ancient history. This is a blueprint for how you can face your own impossible battles today. The story begins in the kingdom of Judah around 850 BC. King Jehoshaphat sits on his throne, a good king who has spent years trying to lead his people closer to God. He's torn down idols, appointed judges to ensure justice, and taught the people God's laws. Under his reign, Judah has experienced peace and prosperity. But prosperity has a way of attracting enemies. Three powerful nations have formed an unholy alliance: the Moabites, the Ammonites, and the Meunites. These aren't just neighboring tribes having a border dispute. These are established kingdoms with professional armies, battle-tested warriors, and a burning hatred for God's people. They've been planning this invasion for months, maybe years. The intelligence reports flooding into Jerusalem paint a terrifying picture. The Moabites are coming from the east, their chariots cutting through the desert like knives through silk. The Ammonites march from the north, their infantry trained in the brutal fighting techniques that have conquered city after city. The Meunites advance from the south, masters of guerrilla warfare who know how to strike fast and disappear into the wilderness. But it's not just the size of these armies that makes them dangerous. It's their coordination. These three nations have put aside their own differences to focus on one goal: the complete annihilation of Judah. They've studied Judah's defenses. They know exactly where to strike to cause maximum damage. They've chosen their timing perfectly, waiting for harvest season, when Judah's men would be scattered across the countryside, busy with crops, instead of warfare. Jehoshaphat receives the news while holding court in Jerusalem. A messenger bursts through the palace doors, his clothes torn, his face white with terror. "My lord," he gasps, falling to his knees. "They're coming, all of them. The Moabites, the Ammonites, the Meunites, they've joined forces. Their armies stretch from horizon to horizon." The throne room falls silent. Advisors exchange worried glances. Military commanders calculate impossible odds in their heads. Everyone knows what this means. Judah is facing extinction. The messenger continues, his voice shaking. "They're already past En-gedi, my lord. They'll reach Tekoa by tomorrow, Jerusalem by the end of the week. Maybe sooner." En-Gedi, that's barely 20 miles away. For a moment, the reality hits everyone in the room like a physical blow. This isn't a distant threat anymore. Death is marching toward their gates with mathematical precision. Jehoshaphat's military advisors immediately begin their calculations. We have maybe 8,000 fighting men, the chief commander reports grimly. If we include every farmer who can hold a spear, every young man barely old enough to fight, we might reach 12,000. And they have, Jehoshaphat asks, though he already suspects the answer. Conservative estimates put their combined forces at over 100,000, probably more. The numbers hang in the air like a death sentence. 12,000 against 100,000, it's not even a fair fight. It's a massacre waiting to happen. One advisor suggests immediate surrender. Perhaps we can negotiate terms, he says desperately. If we offer tribute, maybe they'll spare the city. Another proposes fleeing. We could evacuate the royal family, preserve the bloodline, regroup somewhere safe, and plan a counterattack in a few years. A third recommends a preemptive strike. Hit them while they're still separated. Take out one army before they can unite. But Jehoshaphat listens to all these suggestions with a strange calm settling over his face. His advisors see something in his expression that they've never seen before. Not fear, not panic, not even grim determination. Something else entirely. You see, Jehoshaphat has learned something that most people never learn: the difference between human strength and divine strength. He's spent years walking with God, and he knows that the size of your enemy matters far less than the size of your God. While his advisors debate military strategy, Jehoshaphat's mind goes to a different place entirely. He remembers the stories his father told him, stories of how God delivered Israel from Egypt, how he parted the Red Sea, how he brought down the walls of Jericho. He remembers David facing Goliath, not with superior weapons, but with superior faith. And suddenly, Jehoshaphat realizes something that changes everything. This battle isn't really about Judah versus 3 armies. It's about whether God is still the God of impossible victories. The room continues buzzing with desperate planning, but Jehoshaphat raises his hand for silence. When he speaks, his voice carries a strange authority that makes everyone stop talking. "Gentlemen," he says quietly, "I believe we're approaching this wrong." His chief military advisor looks confused. "Wrong, my lord. What do you mean?" "We're trying to figure out how we can win this battle." Jehoshaphat continues, "But what if this battle isn't ours to win?" The room erupts in confusion. "My lord, with respect, whose battle would it be?" Jehoshaphat stands slowly from his throne, and for the first time since the messenger arrived, he smiles. Not the smile of a man in denial, but the smile of a man who has just remembered something incredibly important. This battle belongs to God. The advisors look at each other uncertainly. They're used to thinking in terms of troops and weapon strategy and logistics. But their king is speaking a different language entirely. "Send messengers throughout all Judah." Jehoshaphat commands, "Call for a fast, every man, woman, and child. Tell them to come to Jerusalem. We're going to pray." Pray, his military commander can't hide his shock. "My lord, shouldn't we be sharpening swords instead of kneeling into prayer?" The enemy will be here in days, but Jehoshaphat's decision is made. Commander, I've seen what our swords can do against impossible odds. Now I want to see what God can do. And so begins one of the most extraordinary preparations for battle in human history. Instead of mobilizing troops, Jehoshaphat mobilizes prayer. Instead of stockpiling weapons, he calls for fasting. And instead of building defenses, he builds altars. The response from the people of Judah is immediate and overwhelming. From every town and village, families begin the journey to Jerusalem. They come on foot carrying their children, bringing whatever provisions they can spare. They come despite the approaching armies, despite the danger, despite every logical reason to flee in the opposite direction. Why? Because they trust their king, and their king trusts his God. As the people gather in Jerusalem, an interesting transformation begins to take place. The city that should be paralyzed by terror is instead filled with a strange sense of anticipation. Not the anticipation of defeat, but the anticipation of seeing what God will do when his people call upon him in their hour of greatest need. The scene in Jerusalem is unlike anything anyone has ever witnessed. The temple courts overflow with people, men, women, children, elderly, young, rich, poor, all united by their desperate need for divine intervention. The usual social barriers disappear. Merchants kneel beside farmers, nobles pray alongside servants. Everyone is equal before God, and everyone knows that only God can save them now. Jehoshaphat doesn't just call for prayer. He leads by example. He stands before the great altar in front of the temple, raises his hands toward heaven, and begins to pray with a voice that carries across the entire crowd. Lord, the God of our ancestors, are you not the God who is in heaven? You rule over all the kingdoms of the nations. Power and might are in your hand, and no one can withstand you. His voice grows stronger as he continues, and you can hear the faith building with every word. Our God, did you not drive out the inhabitants of this land before your people Israel, and give it forever to the descendants of Abraham, your friend? They have lived in it and have built in it a sanctuary for your name, saying, if calamity comes upon us, whether the sword of judgment or plague or famine, we will stand in your presence before this temple that bears your name and will cry out to you in our distress, and you will hear us and save us. This isn't just prayer. This is legal argument. Jehoshaphat is reminding God of his promises, calling him to account for his own words. He's building his case not on Judah's strength, but on God's faithfulness. But now, here are men from Ammon, Moab, and Mount Seir, whose territory you would not allow Israel to invade when they came from Egypt. So they turned away from them and did not destroy them. See how they are repaying us by coming to drive us out of the possession you gave us as an inheritance. The crowd listens in complete silence. You can hear the wind moving through the trees, the distant sound of children crying, the shuffling of feet on stone. But mostly, you hear faith being forged in the furnace of desperation. And then Jehoshaphat speaks the words that will change everything. Our God, will you not judge them? For we have no power to face this vast army that is attacking us. We do not know what to do, but our eyes are on you. There it is. Complete total, absolute surrender to God's will. Not surrender to the enemy, but surrender to the God who controls all enemies. Jehoshaphat has just admitted what every human being eventually must admit when faced with impossible circumstances. We have no power, we have no plan, but we have a God who specializes in impossible circumstances. The prayer echoes across the temple courts and seems to hang in the air like incense. For a moment, nobody moves. The weight of what has just been said settles over the crowd like a heavy blanket. Then, something extraordinary happens. A young man in the crowd begins to shake. At first, people think he might be afraid, but as they look closer, they realize this is something else entirely. The Spirit of the Lord is coming upon him. His name is Jahaziel, a Levite, a descendant of Asaph. He's not a famous prophet or a well-known leader. He's just a regular guy who happens to be in the right place at the right moment when God decides to speak. Jahaziel pushes through the crowd toward the front, his movements urgent but controlled. People step aside as they recognize what's happening. God is about to give his answer. When Jahaziel reaches the front, he turns to face the assembled multitude. His voice, when he speaks, carries an authority that definitely doesn't come from him. Everyone knows they're hearing not just the words of a man, but the words of the Almighty God. Listen, King Jehoshaphat, and all who live in Judah and Jerusalem. This is what the Lord says to you. Do not be afraid or discouraged because of this vast army, for the battle is not yours but God's. A murmur runs through the crowd. Did he just say what they think he said? The battle belongs to God. Jahaziel continues, his voice growing stronger. Tomorrow, march down against them. They will be climbing up by the pass of Ziz, and you will find them at the end of the gorge, in the desert of Jeruel. People are frantically trying to picture the geography in their minds. The pass of Ziz, they know it. It's a narrow canyon where an army would be forced to move in single file, vulnerable, exposed. The desert of Jeruel, a flat plain where there's nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. But here's where the prophecy takes an unexpected turn. You will not have to fight this battle. Take up your positions. Stand firm and see the deliverance the Lord will give you, Judah and Jerusalem. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. Go out to face them tomorrow, and the Lord will be with you. Wait, what? You will not have to fight this battle. The crowd erupts in confused whispers. March out to face the enemy, but don't fight. What kind of military strategy is that? How do you win a battle without fighting? But Jehoshaphat doesn't hesitate for even a second. He falls face down before the altar, and immediately every person in that vast crowd follows his example. The temple courts become a sea of people prostrated before God, worshiping not for victory they've seen, but for victory they've been promised. This is faith in its purest form, believing God's word even when it doesn't make human sense, even when it contradicts everything you know about warfare, even when you're risking everything on a promise that seems impossible. As the crowd worships, something begins to shift in the spiritual atmosphere over Jerusalem. The fear that had gripped the city like a vice starts to loosen. The panic that had driven people to desperation begins to transform into something else: anticipation. If God says the battle belongs to him, then let God fight it. If God says they don't need to fight, then maybe their job is something entirely different. Maybe their job is to trust. Maybe their job is to worship. Maybe their job is to watch God do what only God can do. The worship continues long into the night. Families pray together. Strangers become friends through shared desperation and hope, and the sound of thousands of voices praising God rises over Jerusalem like a sweet fragrance. But even as they worship the enemy, armies continue their approach. They're making good time, these professional soldiers. They know exactly what they're doing. Their scouts have reported that Judah's army is nowhere to be seen, that the people are all gathered in Jerusalem, apparently paralyzed by fear. The Moabite commanders share confident smiles around their campfires. The Ammonite generals sharpen their swords with casual confidence. The Ammonite leaders discuss how to divide the spoils they'll take from Judah's treasuries. They have no idea that their advance toward Jerusalem is actually an advance toward their own destruction. They think they're hunters, but they're about to become prey. They believe they're writing Judah's obituary, but they're actually writing their own. Meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, dawn breaks over a city transformed. The terror of yesterday has been replaced by a strange calm. People move with purpose, but not panic. They're preparing for battle, but not in the way anyone would expect. Jehoshaphat calls his military commanders together, but instead of discussing battle formations and siege defense, he makes an announcement that leaves them speechless. "We're going out to meet them." "My lord," his chief commander protests, "we discussed this yesterday. We don't have the numbers. We don't have the weapons. This would be suicide." "Yes," Jehoshaphat agrees calmly. "It would be suicide if we were depending on ourselves. But we're not depending on ourselves. We're depending on God." "But, my lord, how exactly do we fight without fighting? What does that even mean?" Jehoshaphat smiles, and his commanders see something in his eyes that they've never seen before: absolute, unshakable confidence. Not in his own abilities, not in his army's strength, but in his God's faithfulness. "Gentlemen, I want you to arrange the army in marching formation, but instead of putting our best fighters in front, I want you to put our singers in front." The commanders look at each other as if their king has lost his mind. "Singers, my lord, singers, musicians, the choir. I want them leading our army into battle." "My lord, with all due respect, have you considered that singers are not typically equipped with armor or weapons? They won't be much help if someone starts shooting arrows." "Commander, I don't want them equipped with armor and weapons. I want them equipped with faith and songs of praise. God said we don't have to fight this battle. So instead of preparing for war, we're going to prepare for worship." The room falls silent as the full implications of what their king is saying begin to sink in. He's not just talking about unusual military tactics. He's talking about something that has never been tried before in the history of warfare: winning a battle through worship instead of warfare. One young commander finds the courage to voice what everyone is thinking. "My lord, what if this doesn't work? What if we march out there singing songs and the enemy just kills us all?" Jehoshaphat's answer reveals the depth of his faith. "Son, if we're going to die anyway, wouldn't you rather die trusting God than die trusting yourself. At least if we die His way, we die with the possibility of a miracle. If we die our way, we just die. And so begins the most unusual military preparation in history. Instead of sharpening swords, the army practices harmonies. Instead of drilling formations, they rehearse lyrics. Instead of studying battle plans, they meditate on God's promises. The choir director, a man named Jeduthun, finds himself in a position he never imagined. Military advisor to the king of Judah. Jehoshaphat calls him to the palace to discuss strategy, but not the kind of strategy anyone would expect. Jeduthun, I need you to select songs for tomorrow's march, songs that declare God's faithfulness, His power, His love for His people. My lord, Jeduthun responds carefully. I've selected songs for worship services, for festivals, for celebrations, but I've never selected songs for battle. That's because there's never been a battle like this one, Jehoshaphat replies. Tomorrow worship becomes warfare. Tomorrow praise becomes our primary weapon. Tomorrow we fight with songs instead of swords. Jeduthun spends the evening going through the ancient songs of Israel, looking for lyrics that speak of God's power to deliver His ability to save His faithful love that endures forever. He chooses songs that have been sung for generations, songs that carry the weight of centuries of faith. The song he finally selects as their battle hymn is one that goes back to the time of Moses. Give thanks to the Lord, for His love endures forever. Simple words, ancient words, but words that carry the power of absolute truth. As night falls over Jerusalem, the city buzzes with an energy that's hard to describe. People are excited, but not with the bloodthirsty excitement that usually precedes battle. They're excited with the anticipation of seeing God do something spectacular. Children practice the songs with their parents. Elderly men who remember previous wars shake their heads in wonder at what they're witnessing. Women pack food for their husbands, but instead of packing weapons, they pack tambourines and lyres. Meanwhile, just 20 miles away, the enemy coalition is putting the finishing touches on their battle plans. Their scouts have reported something strange happening in Jerusalem. Lots of singing, not much military activity. But they interpret this as evidence that Judah has given up hope, that the people are singing funeral dirges for their own demise. The Moabite general addresses his troops with confident swagger. Men, tomorrow we finish what we started. These people have no fight left in them. Their king has lost his mind. They're singing songs while we sharpen our swords. By tomorrow night, Judah will be nothing but a memory. The Ammonite commander is equally confident. We've planned this perfectly. 3 armies, 3 different approaches, perfectly coordinated timing. There's no way they can escape. There's no way they can win. The Ammonite leader adds his own assessment. I have been fighting these people for 20 years. I know how they think, how they fight. Tomorrow will be the easiest victory we've ever achieved. They have no idea that while they're planning Judah's destruction, God is planning theirs. They have no clue that their confidence is about to become their downfall. They can't imagine that by this time tomorrow their great alliance will be nothing but corpses scattered across the desert floor. Dawn breaks over a divided landscape. In the enemy camp, soldiers strap on armor and sharpen weapons with grim efficiency. They move with the confidence of professional killers who have done this many times before. In Jerusalem, a very different kind of army is preparing for a very different kind of battle. Jehoshaphat stands before his troops, if you can call them a troops. It's the strangest military formation anyone has ever seen. At the front, instead of armored warriors, stand the singers and musicians. They're dressed not in battle gear, but in their finest robes, the same clothes they wear for temple worship. Behind them stand the actual soldiers, but even they seem different this morning. There's no nervous energy, no last-minute weapon checks, no grim-faced preparation for violence. Instead, there's a calm confidence that seems to emanate from their king himself. Jehoshaphat addresses his people one final time before they march out to meet destiny. "Listen to me, Judah, and people of Jerusalem. Have faith in the Lord your God, and you will be upheld. Have faith in his prophets, and you will be successful." His voice carries across the assembled multitude with absolute conviction. This is not a man trying to convince himself. This is a man who has wrestled with God in prayer and emerged with unshakable confidence in God's faithfulness. Today, we march not as warriors, but as worshipers. Today, we fight not with swords, but with songs. Today, we win not through our strength, but through our surrender to the God who fights for us. The crowd responds with a roar of agreement that echoes off the walls of Jerusalem. But it's not the savage war cry of soldiers preparing for slaughter. It's the joyful shout of people who believe they're about to witness the impossible. And then they march. Picture this scene at the front of the procession, singers and musicians, their voices already beginning to rise in harmony. Their song echoes off the hills around Jerusalem, a sound unlike anything these stones have ever heard. It's worship music, but it carries the force of a battle cry. Give thanks to the Lord, for his love endures forever. Give thanks to the Lord, for his love endures forever. Behind the choir, the army of Judah follows, but they're not marching to drums of war. They're marching to songs of faith. Their steps keep time, not with military cadence, but with melodies of praise. The sight is so unusual that birds stop singing to listen. The sound is so powerful that the very ground seems to vibrate with the force of their faith. As the procession makes its way through the streets of Jerusalem and out toward the wilderness, something extraordinary happens. The fear that had gripped the city for days completely evaporates. In its place rises something that can only be described as holy anticipation. They're not marching toward battle. They're marching toward miracle. They're not going out to fight. They're going out to watch God fight for them. They're not carrying weapons of war. They're carrying instruments of worship, and somehow everyone knows that these will prove more powerful than any sword ever forged. The procession continues through the Judean wilderness, following the ancient paths that their ancestors had walked for generations. But this march is different from any that has ever been taken along these roads. As they walk, the singing grows stronger. More voices join in. The simple melody that started with the choir now involves thousands of people, and the sound rises toward heaven like incense from a massive altar. Give thanks to the Lord, for his love endures forever. The words repeat over and over. but they don't become monotonous. Instead, they become more powerful with each repetition. Each voice that joins in adds to the strength of the declaration. Each step they take toward the enemy becomes a step deeper into faith. Meanwhile, the enemy coalition has begun their final advance. 3 armies converging on what they believe will be an easy victory. Their timing is perfect, their coordination flawless, their confidence absolute. The Moabites approach from the east, moving through rocky terrain that provides good cover. Their commander has chosen this route specifically because it will allow them to strike Judah's flank while the other armies engage from different directions. The Ammonites advance from the north, following a well-traveled trade route that will bring them directly to Jerusalem's gates. Their heavy infantry is perfectly suited for this kind of direct assault. The Munites sweep up from the south, their cavalry units prepared to cut off any escape routes and run down any survivors who try to flee. It's a textbook 3-pronged attack, the kind of coordinated assault that has conquered kingdoms throughout the ancient world. Every contingency has been planned for, except one. They have no plan for what to do if God shows up. As the morning progresses, both forces continue their approach toward the rendezvous that will change everything. Judah marches singing toward the desert of Jeruel, where God has promised to deliver them. The coalition armies advance with deadly precision toward what they believe will be their greatest triumph. But something begins to happen in the spiritual realm that neither side can see with physical eyes. Angels begin to move. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob begins to stir himself to action. The same God who delivered Israel from Egypt, who parted the Red Sea, who brought down the walls of Jericho, prepares to demonstrate once again that he is the God who specializes in impossible victories. As Judah's singing procession crests a hill and begins its descent toward the desert of Jeruel, they can see dust clouds on the horizon. The enemy is close now, very close. For a moment, some of the singers falter. The reality of what they're walking into hits them like a physical blow. Those aren't just dust clouds. Those are armies. Massive, professional, deadly armies that have been planning their destruction for months. But Jehoshaphat's voice rises above the momentary uncertainty. Sing louder, praise harder. Our God is about to do something spectacular. And the singing swells again stronger than before. The momentary doubt is swallowed up in waves of worship that seem to roll across the landscape like thunder. They're close enough now to see individual soldiers in the enemy formations, close enough to see the glint of sunlight on spear points and sword blades, close enough to see the confident expressions on enemy faces as these professional killers prepare to do what they do best. The two forces are converging on the desert of Jeruel, exactly as the prophet Jahaziel had predicted. Everything is unfolding with supernatural precision. And then, just as the armies come within sight of each other, just as the enemy commanders prepare to give the order to charge, something happens that no one could have anticipated. It starts small. A disagreement between two soldiers in the Ammonite ranks. Someone accidentally bumps into someone else. Words are exchanged, tempers flare, but instead of being quickly resolved as such incidents usually are, this minor conflict begins to escalate. The Ammonite soldier, already nervous about the upcoming battle, overreacts to what should have been a trivial incident. He draws his sword. In any normal circumstance, his commander would immediately restore order. But for some reason, a reason that can only be explained by divine intervention, the commander misinterprets what he's seeing. In the dust and confusion of an army on the march with adrenaline running high and nerves on edge, the Ammonite commander thinks his soldier is drawing his sword in response to an attack from their Moabite allies. The commander shouts a warning to his troops. "The Moabites are turning on us." It's not true. But in the chaos of the moment, with thousands of armed men already keyed up for violence, truth becomes irrelevant. What matters is perception, and perception becomes reality in the span of a heartbeat. The Moabite soldiers, hearing the Ammonite shouts and seeing weapons being drawn, assume they're under attack. Their training kicks in and they respond exactly as they've been taught, with immediate, overwhelming violence. Within seconds, what should have been a coordinated assault on Judah turns into a three-way massacre as the coalition armies turn their weapons on each other. From their position on the hills overlooking the desert, Judah watches in stunned amazement as the miracle unfolds before their eyes. The Moabites, convinced that the Ammonites have betrayed them, launch a furious attack on their former allies. The Ammonites, certain that the Moabites have broken their agreement, fight back with desperate savagery. The Munites, caught between the two larger forces and unable to determine what's happening, begin attacking anyone who comes near them. It's carnage on an unimaginable scale. 3 professional armies, each consisting of seasoned warriors, are destroying each other with the same efficiency they had planned to use on Judah. The irony is staggering. These men who had come to destroy God's people are instead destroying each other. These weapons that had been sharpened for conquest are instead being used for suicide. These armies that had been perfectly coordinated are now perfectly coordinated in their own destruction. From Judah's perspective on the hillside, the scene below looks like something out of a nightmare. Dust clouds rise from the desert floor as thousands of men engage in hand-to-hand combat. The sound of clashing metal echoes off the surrounding cliffs. Shouts of rage and screams of pain carry across the landscape like a symphony of judgment. But perhaps the most remarkable thing is Judah's response to what they're witnessing. They keep singing, "Give thanks to the Lord, for his love endures forever." Their voices rise even louder now, not in celebration of the violence they're witnessing, but in celebration of the deliverance they're receiving. They're not rejoicing in their enemy's death, they're rejoicing in their own life. This is the God they serve. This is the God who keeps his promises. This is the God who fights for his people when they're too weak to fight for themselves. Jehoshaphat stands among his people, his own voice contributing to the chorus of praise, and tears stream down his face. Not tears of sadness, but tears of awe. He's watching the God of the universe demonstrate his power on behalf of people who simply chose to trust him. The battle, if it can even be called a battle, continues for hours. The 3 armies are so focused on destroying each other that they never even notice Judah watching from the hills. They're too busy fulfilling their own prophecy of doom to remember why they came to this desert in the first place. By midday, the sounds of fighting begin to diminish, not because the armies have achieved victory, but because they've achieved mutual annihilation. The desert of Jeruel, which had been chosen as the site of Judah's destruction, has instead become the graveyard of Judah's enemies. As the dust begins to settle, the scope of what has happened becomes clear. 3 armies that had marched toward Judah with confidence and precision now lie scattered across the desert floor like broken toys discarded by a child. The Moabites, who had been so confident in their battle plans, are decimated. The Ammonites, who had boasted about their superior numbers, are destroyed. The Meunites, who had claimed expertise in desert warfare, have become permanent residents of the desert they thought they knew so well. And through it all, Judah has done exactly what God told them to do. They stood firm, they watched, and they saw the deliverance the Lord gave them. Not a single soldier from Judah has been injured. Not one drop of Jewish blood has been shed. They marched out to face annihilation and instead witnessed the annihilation of their enemies. As the reality of what has happened begins to sink in, the singing of the people of Judah transforms. It's no longer the determined praise of people choosing to trust God in desperate circumstances. It's become the joyful celebration of people who have just witnessed the impossible. Give thanks to the Lord, for His love endures forever. The words that had begun as an act of faith have become a statement of fact. God's love has indeed endured forever, and they've just seen proof that extends across an entire desert floor. But the miracle isn't over yet. As Jehoshaphat leads his people down from the hills to examine what remains of their enemies, they discover something that leaves them speechless all over again. The battlefield is littered not just with the bodies of their enemies, but with wealth beyond their wildest imagination. These 3 armies hadn't just come to conquer Judah, they had come prepared to stay. They had brought with them everything they owned: gold and silver, precious gems and fine clothing, livestock and equipment, weapons and armor of the finest quality. All of it now belongs to Judah. The spoils of war are so abundant that it takes 3 full days just to collect them all. Jewelry that would have bought entire cities, gold that would have funded armies, silver that would have built palaces, precious stones that would have adorned kings. And it all belongs to the people who won a battle without fighting. The transformation in Judah's economic situation is immediate and dramatic. A nation that had been facing potential extinction now finds itself wealthier than it had ever been in its history. Families that had been poor now find themselves with more resources than they know how to manage. The royal treasury, which had been strained by years of military preparation, now overflows with riches. But perhaps more important than the material wealth is the spiritual transformation that takes place in the hearts of God's people. For 3 days they work to collect the spoils of their miraculous victory. And for 3 days the singing continues. Men work to load wagons with gold while singing praises to God. Women sort through precious clothing while declaring God's faithfulness. Children play among piles of silver while learning the songs of deliverance that they'll sing for the rest of their lives. This isn't just cleanup after a battle. It's an extended worship service that happens to involve collecting treasure. On the 4th day, they gather in what they name the Valley of Barakah, the Valley of Praise, for a formal ceremony of thanksgiving. The entire nation comes together to officially acknowledge what God has done for them. Jehoshaphat stands before his people holding in his hands a crown taken from one of the enemy kings. But instead of placing it on his own head as a symbol of conquest, he lifts it toward heaven as an offering of praise. This victory belongs to God alone. He declares his voice carrying across the valley. We came here with songs and God gave us victory. We brought worship and God brought warfare. We offered praise and God offered protection. The ceremony in the valley of Barakah becomes legendary. For generations afterward, when parents tell their children stories of God's faithfulness, they point to this valley and say, "This is where we learned that God fights for those who trust Him completely." The singing that had begun as an act of desperate faith now becomes a celebration that echoes for miles. The same songs that had accompanied them into battle now accompany them home in triumph. But the words carry deeper meaning now. They're not just hoping that God's love endures forever. They've seen proof that it does. As the procession prepares to return to Jerusalem, loaded down with more wealth than they can carry, something beautiful happens. The singing spreads beyond Judah's borders. Travelers passing through the region hear the songs and ask what's being celebrated. When they learn the story of how God delivered Judah from impossible odds, many of them join their voices to the chorus. The news of the miracle spreads from caravan to caravan, from trader to trader, from nation to nation. The march back to Jerusalem becomes a parade of divine victory that grows larger with every mile. People from surrounding regions come out just to see the army that won without fighting, to hear the songs that proved more powerful than swords, to witness the spoils of a battle that God fought for them. By the time they reach Jerusalem, the procession has swollen to massive proportions. The city gates can barely contain the crowd of people who have come to celebrate what God has done. But here's what makes this victory different from every other military triumph in history. There are no enemy prisoners marching in chains. There are no conquered peoples forced to bow before Judah's king. There are no displays of human domination or cruelty. Instead, there are songs. There are testimonies of God's faithfulness. There are stories of how worship became warfare and faith became victory. The celebration continues for days. Musicians compose new songs about the battle that wasn't a battle. Poets write verses about the king who won by kneeling instead of fighting. Artists create works depicting singers leading armies and worship defeating warfare. But the most important impact of this victory isn't artistic or economic or even military. It's spiritual. Throughout the region, people begin to understand something profound about the God of Israel. This isn't just a tribal deity who favors his people in battle. This is the God who controls the hearts of kings, who orchestrates the movements of armies, who can turn the weapons of the wicked against themselves. More importantly, this is a God who responds to faith. Not just any kind of faith, but the kind of radical, all-in, completely surrendered faith that Jehoshaphat demonstrated when he chose worship over warfare. The story spreads throughout the ancient world, and everywhere it goes, it carries the same message. There is a God in heaven who fights for those who trust Him completely, who delivers those who surrender to Him totally, who gives victory to those who choose worship over warfare. But let's pause here and ask the question that's probably running through your mind. What does this ancient story have to do with your life today? You're not facing 3 armies marching across the desert toward your city. You're not a king responsible for defending a nation. You're not living in ancient Israel, where prophets speak directly from God and miracles happen on battlefields. Or are you? Maybe you're not facing the Moabites, Ammonites, and Meunites, but you are facing your own coalition of enemies. Maybe they're not carrying swords and spears, but they're just as real and just as threatening. Maybe your Moabites are the financial pressures that keep you awake at night, the bills that pile up faster than your income, the economic uncertainty that makes every day feel like a battle for survival. Maybe your Ammonites are the relationship conflicts that drain your energy and break your heart. The marriage that's falling apart, the children who have walked away from everything you taught them, the friendships that have turned toxic, the family members who have become enemies. Maybe your Meunites are the health challenges that have invaded your body like an occupying army, the diagnosis that changed everything, the chronic pain that colors every moment, the mental health struggles that make getting out of bed feel like climbing a mountain. Or perhaps your enemies wear different names: addiction, depression, anxiety, grief, loneliness, purposelessness, hopelessness. They may not carry physical weapons, but they're just as capable of destroying your life. The question is, when these enemies form their coalition against you, when they coordinate their attack on your peace, your purpose, your very survival, what do? Most of us do exactly what Jehoshaphat's advisors suggested. We try to fight them with our own strength. We sharpen our swords of willpower. We mobilize our armies of human effort. We build our defenses of self-reliance and prepare to battle our problems with everything we've got. And sometimes that approach works. Sometimes human effort is enough to overcome human problems. Sometimes willpower wins the day, but what about when it doesn't? What about when your problems are bigger than your solutions? What about when your enemies outnumber your resources 10-1? What about when you're facing the kind of impossible odds that Jehoshaphat faced? That's when you need to learn the lesson of the battle that wasn't a battle. That's when you need to discover that there's a different way to fight. That's when you need to understand that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop trying to fight and start learning to worship. Now, before you dismiss this as impractical, spiritual advice that doesn't apply to real-world problems, let me ask you something. How's your current strategy working for you? If fighting your battles with your own strength was going to work, wouldn't it have worked by now? If human solutions were sufficient for your problems, wouldn't you have solved them already? If willpower and determination were enough, wouldn't you have won your wars by now? Maybe it's time to try Jehoshaphat's approach. Maybe it's time to call a fast instead of calling a meeting. Maybe it's time to kneel in prayer instead of standing in your own strength. Maybe it's time to surrender your battles to God instead of trying to win them yourself. Now, I'm not talking about passive resignation. I'm not suggesting that you just give up and hope your problems magically disappear. Jehoshaphat didn't stay home and hide. He marched out to face his enemies. But he marched out with worship, instead of weapons with faith, instead of force with surrender, instead of strategy. The difference is profound. When you fight your battles with human strength, you're limited by human resources. Your energy runs out. Your options become exhausted. Your strength eventually fails. But when you surrender your battles to God, you're accessing resources that are unlimited. You're tapping into strength that never fails. You're employing strategies that your enemies can't anticipate or counter. Let me give you some practical examples of what this looks like in modern life. When financial pressure is threatening to destroy your family, instead of panicking and making desperate decisions, you pray. You seek God's wisdom for your situation. You ask Him to provide solutions you can't see and opportunities you haven't considered. You worship Him for His faithfulness, even while the bills pile up on your kitchen table. And then you watch as He opens doors you didn't know existed, brings opportunities you never anticipated, and provides for your needs in ways that can only be explained as miraculous. When your marriage is under attack, and human counseling has failed, and communication has broken down, and divorce seems inevitable instead of giving up or trying to force your spouse to change you, surrender your marriage to God. You pray for your spouse instead of fighting with them. You worship God for His ability to heal what seems beyond healing. And then you watch as God begins to soften hearts, restore communication, and rebuild love that you thought was dead forever. When health challenges threaten to rob you of hope, and medical science has reached its limits, and the doctors have done all they can do, instead of surrendering to despair, you surrender to God. You worship Him for His healing power. You praise Him for His ability to do what medicine cannot do. And then you watch as He brings healing that defies medical explanation, strength that transcends human understanding, and peace that passes all comprehension. When depression and anxiety have formed their coalition against your mental health, and therapy has helped but hasn't solved everything, and medication has reached its limits, instead of accepting defeat, you accept God's invitation to cast your cares on Him. You worship your way through the darkness. You praise your way past the fear, and then you watch as God brings light into places that have been dark for years, hope into situations that seemed hopeless, and joy into circumstances that had only produced sorrow. This isn't wishful thinking. This isn't positive psychology dressed up in religious language. This is the same principle that worked for Jehoshaphat working in your life today. But here's the crucial point. It only works when your surrender is complete. Jehoshaphat didn't keep a backup plan. He didn't send his choir out front while keeping his real army hidden in reserve just in case God didn't come through. He went all in on God's promise. He bet everything on God's faithfulness. That's what real faith looks like. Not the kind of faith that uses God as a backup plan when human solutions fail, but the kind of faith that makes God the primary plan from the beginning. Not the kind of faith that asks God to bless your strategies, but the kind of faith that surrenders your strategies to God's wisdom. Not the kind of faith that tries to manipulate God into doing what you want, but the kind of faith that trusts God to do what He knows is best. This is where most people struggle with the Jehoshaphat approach. We want God to fight our battles, but we want to choose the battlefield. We want God to give us victory, but we want to define what victory looks like. We want God to solve our problems, but we want to control how He solves them. But that's not surrender. That's negotiation. Real surrender means releasing control of the outcome. It means trusting God's timing even when it doesn't match your timeline. It means accepting God's methods even when they don't make sense to your human understanding. Real surrender means being willing to look foolish in the eyes of the world if that's what trusting God requires. Think about how foolish Jehoshaphat must have looked to his enemies. They saw him marching out with singers instead of soldiers, with musicians instead of warriors, with worship leaders instead of military commanders. They probably laughed at what they saw as evidence of his complete mental breakdown, right up until the moment they started killing each other. Your enemies, whether they're financial, relational, physical, emotional, or spiritual, are probably going to laugh at you too when you choose worship over warfare. They're going to mock your faith, question your sanity, and predict your destruction. Right up until the moment God turns them against each other and gives you a victory you never could have achieved on your own. But here's what you need to understand. God's methods often look like foolishness until they produce miraculous results. God told Joshua to march around Jericho's walls instead of attacking them directly. That probably looked pretty foolish to the people inside the city, until the walls came tumbling down. God told Gideon to reduce his army from 32,000 to 300 before facing an enemy that outnumbered them like grasshoppers. That probably looked like military suicide, until those 300 defeated the entire Midianite army. God told Moses to hold up a staff at the Red Sea instead of building boats to cross it. That probably looked like the desperate act of a man who had lost touch with reality, until the waters parted and Israel walked across on dry ground. God's strategies often defy human logic, but they produce results that exceed human capability. The question is, are you willing to trust God's strategy even when it doesn't make sense to your human understanding? Are you willing to worship your way through battles instead of fighting your way through them? Are you willing to surrender control of your problems to the God who controls everything? Let me tell you what happens when you make that choice. First, you discover a peace that you never knew was possible. When you stop trying to control outcomes you can't control and start trusting the God who controls all outcomes, the anxiety that has been eating you alive begins to lose its power over you. You still care about the results. You still want good things to happen, but you're no longer carrying the crushing weight of believing that everything depends on your effort, your wisdom, your strength. Second, you begin to see solutions that you never would have seen while you were focused on fighting. When you stop trying to force your way through problems and start asking God to show you His way through them, you suddenly notice doors that were always there, but that you were too busy fighting to see. Third, you experience a kind of victory that lasts longer than victories you achieve through human effort. When you win battles through your own strength, you know you'll have to fight them again tomorrow. But when God wins battles for you, they tend to stay won. Fourth, you develop a relationship with God that transforms every area of your life. When you learn to trust God with your biggest problems, trusting Him with smaller issues becomes most natural. When you experience His faithfulness in crisis, you begin to rely on His faithfulness in everyday life. But perhaps most importantly, you become a witness to others of what God can do for people who trust Him completely. Remember how the news of Jehoshaphat's victory spread throughout the ancient world. Remember how people from other nations came to see the army that won without fighting. Remember how the story of God's faithfulness traveled from caravan to caravan until the whole region knew what the God of Israel had done. That's what happens when you win battles God's way. Your victory becomes a testimony. Your deliverance becomes a demonstration. Your story becomes a source of hope for other people who are facing their own impossible battles. Your co-workers watch as you handle financial pressure with peace instead of panic, and they want to know your secret. Your neighbors see your marriage getting stronger while theirs are falling apart, and they ask for your advice. Your friends notice that you're walking through health challenges with hope instead of despair, and they wonder what's different about you. Your family members observe that you're dealing with depression and anxiety in a way they've never seen before, and they want to understand how. Your victory becomes their invitation to discover the same God who fights for people who trust Him completely. But here's the thing, none of this happens overnight. Learning to worship your way through battles, instead of fighting your way through them, is a process. It requires practice. It demands patience with yourself as you learn new ways of thinking and responding. Jehoshaphat didn't wake up one morning with perfect faith. His response to this crisis was the result of years of walking with God, years of learning to trust God's character, years of building a relationship with a God who keeps His promises. You might not be able to surrender completely on your first attempt. You might find yourself taking control back from God when His timing doesn't match your timeline or His methods don't match your expectations. That's okay. That's normal. That's part of the learning process. The key is to keep coming back to surrender. Every time you catch yourself trying to fight battles that belong to God, stop and surrender them again. Every time you notice yourself worrying about outcomes you can't control, stop and worship the God who controls all outcomes. Eventually, surrender becomes more natural than struggle. Eventually, worship becomes your first response instead of your last resort. Eventually, trusting God becomes easier than trusting yourself. And when that happens, you discover what Jehoshaphat discovered, that God is the God of impossible victories, and He specializes in fighting battles for people who trust Him completely. Let me close with a challenge. Right now, you're probably facing at least one situation that feels impossible. Maybe it's been going on for months or years. Maybe you've tried everything you know how to try. Maybe you're at the end of your human resources and you don't know what to do next. This is your moment. This is your opportunity to try the Jehoshaphat approach. Instead of trying to figure out your next move, surrender the situation to God. Instead of planning your strategy, ask God for His strategy. Instead of fighting harder, worship louder. I'm not suggesting that you ignore practical steps or abandon common sense. I'm suggesting that you approach your impossible situation with the same faith that Jehoshaphat approached his impossible battle. Admit that you have no power to face this vast problem attacking you. Acknowledge that you do not know what to do. but declare that your eyes are on the God who specializes in impossible situations. And then watch. Watch as the God who turned Judah's enemies against each other turns your problems into solutions you never could have imagined. Watch as the God who gave Jehoshaphat victory without violence gives you breakthrough without burnout. Watch as the God who filled Judah's treasury with the wealth of their enemies fills your life with blessings that come from battles you didn't have to fight. You have the same God available to you today that Jehoshaphat had available to him 3,000 years ago. He hasn't changed. His power hasn't diminished. His faithfulness hasn't expired. The question isn't whether God can fight your battles. The question is whether you are willing to let him. The question isn't whether God can give you victory. The question is whether you're willing to trust his methods. The question isn't whether God loves you enough to help you. The question is whether you love him enough to surrender control to him. Today, you have a choice. You can keep fighting your battles with human strength, human wisdom, and human resources. You can keep trying to solve your problems with your own effort and determination. Or you can try something different. You can choose worship over warfare. You can choose surrender over struggle. You can choose to trust the God who fights for those who trust him completely. The choice is yours. But remember, this Jehoshaphat story didn't end with one victory. After he learned to trust God with impossible battles, he continued to experience God's faithfulness in every area of his life. His kingdom prospered. His people experienced peace. His legacy became a testimony to God's faithfulness that we're still talking about today. That could be your story too. Your impossible battle could become the beginning of a life marked by God's faithfulness. Your crisis could become the catalyst for a relationship with God that transforms everything. Your surrender could become the starting point for victories you never dreamed possible. The God who fought for Jehoshaphat is ready to fight for you. The God who turned enemies against each other is ready to turn your problems into solutions. The God who filled the valley of Barakah with songs of praise is ready to fill your life with reasons to worship. All he's waiting for is your surrender. All he needs is your trust. All he wants is your worship. Give thanks to the Lord, for his love endures forever. Even in your impossible situation, his love endures forever. Even when your enemies seem overwhelming, his love endures forever. Even when you don't know what to do next, his love endures forever. That's not just a song. That's not just a hope. That's a promise from the God who keeps all his promises. And if you'll trust him with your battles, you'll discover that it's also your victory song.